Welcome to the Friday edition of Juan's World. I'm going to continue my series on public education today, but the good news is on Tuesday I'm going to do some cooking because I have been working on some Chinese dishes and I'm starting to do the videos. So Tuesday will be chicken in a master sauce, Chinese style. But for now, I want to continue talking about public education. And specifically today, I want to talk about primary education and secondary education, certainly as I experienced them in Australia and in England. I can't talk about the whole world, although I have actually taught some primary education in England and in Myanmar briefly, but I know the systems as they existed at one time, that is in the 50s and 60s. And I want to talk about how they came about, what their usefulness is, and in a way, how we could rethink them. So let's get into that. I did my whole primary education in South Australia. It went from grade 3 to grade 7, which in Australian terms was roughly age 7 to age 12. And then high school, which is a little bit more complicated and I'll talk about in a minute, came after that. But in the 50s, it was still possible to leave school at age 11 in South Australia, and had been, I think, up until the war years in the United Kingdom, maybe before the war, I don't know exactly, but certainly in Australia they followed a very old system of making primary education compulsory, and then secondary education was elective. So my primary education consisted of two distinct components, the morning component and the afternoon component. And the morning was always the same. From the beginning of the school day until morning recess, we did some form of English. Usually on Monday, we read the story in our reading book. It was called The Wide Range Reader, which came out of England, and it had grade 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. So we started off the first half of the year with the blue reader and the second half of the year with the green reader. And we read one story a week. And the story contained the spelling words for the week, some of the grammar points for the week, and first thing Monday morning, each of us had to stand up and recite a few sentences from the story, and then the next person, and when we'd finished the story, we went back to the beginning and read again until everybody in the class had read. And then Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, we did various things, including our spelling words. We did some grammar points. We maybe wrote a little composition. And then on Friday, we had dictation. They would take a passage from the reading book, and our teacher would dictate it to us, and we had to write it down with no capitalization mistakes, spelling mistakes, punctuation mistakes, and so forth. That was the first thing. After recess, we did arithmetic. And first half was mental arithmetic, when we were expected to do various sums. In the third grade, it was mostly chanting our times tables, and we spent most of the year learning the tables from 3 to 12. And then we would also use flashcards and various other accessories to establish multiplication, division, addition, subtraction, and then as we got older, then the mental arithmetic got more complicated. It included money, and of course money in those days was quite complicated because we used pounds, shillings and pence. 12 pence in the shilling, 20 shillings in the pound. Got very complicated, and we have to do mental sums like eggs cost threepence each, and you want 7. How much change will you get from 2 shillings, and so forth. And then after mental arithmetic, we did written arithmetic, and always learning something new each week. And then on Friday, after dictation, we had a test of mental arithmetic, usually 10 problems, followed by 10, 15 sums, and they were all marked: dictation, the mental arithmetic, the written arithmetic, and if we had no errors, we were given what was called full honors, and our names were printed in the local paper, the Bunyip, each week. I didn't get full honors very often, but once in a while. There was one week which I still fondly remember, when I got full honors in grade 6, when instead of written arithmetic, the headmaster had decided to give us 40 mental arithmetic sums, plus the dictation. And I was the only boy in my class, and it was just a boys' class, 35, 40 boys. I was the only one that got all 40 mental arithmetic right. And by sheer luck, I got everything right in the dictation too, so I got full honors. That was the mornings. And then in the afternoon, we did all kinds of different things. We had writing, and that doesn't mean writing compositions. It meant writing as in handwriting or calligraphy. We had to use copperplate writing. We also did a little bit of history one afternoon a week. Almost all English history. Even though we lived in Australia, and Australia had a history of exploration, history of colonialism, history of all kinds of things, but we learned about the kings and queens of England, mostly the Norman conquest and the Tudors and Stuarts, largely because during the Stuart era, constitutional monarchy got off to a start, pretty rocky start, under Charles I, and then under Charles II, and so forth. And we also learned a little bit about the colonial wars, between England and France mostly, and odds and ends. A little bit of geography, some afternoons we played sports, but the curriculum that was really mandated was the morning stuff. The writing, arithmetic, reading, the 3 R's. And it was expected that by the time that you left primary school, you were fully literate, able to read and write, to calculate properly, and that was a good basic primary education. Now, for a long time, people have assumed that the basics of education should be the 3 R's, reading, writing, arithmetic. We got virtually no musical instruction in primary school in South Australia. We did have these peripatetic music teachers who would come once in a great while and teach us a song and would instruct us using solfège, the do-re-mi system. And we also had some radio singing lessons once in a while. We had a little bit of art now and again. But all of that stuff was in the afternoon, and as I said before, afternoon was considered to be frills. The reading, writing, and arithmetic were what you were there to do, and when you had finished with your primary education, you were considered to be ready to go to work. Now, I want to ask this question, and it's a serious question. Why, at that time, was it necessary to read and write? Never mind why we had to write using copperplate. We had dip pens and inkwells, and we had to produce this calligraphic writing, which I could never do. My handwriting now is atrocious. There's a rebellion against years and years of having to write in copperplate. I mean, I can still do it if I want to, but I never want to. Well, you can understand that people who go into some kind of clerical work where you have to write, that's useful. But the vast majority of the people that were in school with me were going to take up farm work, various perhaps unskilled jobs. Did they need to know how to read and write? This is a question that the educational theorist Rudolf Steiner, who's famous for developing Waldorf schools, thought was somewhat misguided. I mean, he thought that people should learn to read and write, but not very early, not at age 5, when I learned to read and write, but maybe at age 8 or later, because he was part of a movement that goes back to the folk movement of the earliest 20th century, where people were beginning to understand that traditional singers, musicians, dancers, and so forth, all over Europe, were completely illiterate. And they composed their songs and remembered their songs, some of them very lengthy, because they had good memories. And the reason that they had good memories was because they had no way of recording anything by writing it down. They had to remember it. And so Steiner believed that there should be a period in a child's life where their memory developed in the absence of reading and writing. Okay, that's point number one. Why do we need to read and write? These days, it's obvious because the digital age requires reading and writing for all kinds of things, and you can't get anywhere without them. But in the early and middle part of the 20th century, it wasn't so crucial. And I know a lot of people who can't read and write, not in England or the United States, but here in Cambodia. In Cambodia during Pol Pot's genocide, anybody with an education was killed, starting off with people with university educations and the university professors, and then moving on down. And so an awful lot of people who had even the most basic education were just killed because they had an education. And the people who were uneducated, mostly peasant farmers, survived, and in fact were moved into Phnom Penh. And the people in the city, if they weren't killed, were moved out into the countryside. So I know a lot of people, middle-aged and older, who can't read and write. And I found this out when I first came here, and I couldn't really speak Khmer, so I would use my phone. I would translate into Khmer what I wanted, and then I would show the Khmer to a person, and they would just look at it blankly, and I realized finally that they couldn't read and write. So I had to learn how to use the translator on my phone to speak in Khmer, and then they would understand. And the fact of the matter is that having a whole generation of illiterates is a problem, but it's not as much of a problem as you might think. We function. My previous landlord, who is about 72 years old, couldn't read and write. And every time we had to sign a contract, every 6 months, he brought in a boy from the shop down a few doors away who would read the contract to him and tell him what needed to be filled in. In fact, mostly filled it in himself, and then my landlord would just sign. He knew how to kind of scrawl a signature. He was quite prosperous. He owned several buildings. He had business interests. He did quite well, even though he was illiterate. Now, there is also what we can call functional illiteracy. And that's an interesting case. Functional illiterates are people who can read, but who don't read. And there are a tremendous number of functional illiterates in the world. In fact, there's very strong evidence, as far as I can tell, that President Trump is functionally illiterate. That is, he is able to read, but he doesn't read. And all of the evidence that is given in the press about his daily briefings, which have to be no more than one page with a lot of pictures in them and so forth, all of that evidence suggests that he's functionally illiterate, and yet he is the President of the United States. So I'm going to go back to my original question. What is the purpose of literacy? What is the purpose of reading and writing as basic? What about computing? I'm talking about arithmetic computing now, not laptops, desktops, what have you. But back in the old days, to be a cashier at a supermarket, you had to be able to ring up the various purchases. Probably the cash register would sum it up, but you would need to make change, and that required at least minimal mental arithmetic. Well, now you don't even have to do that. The barcodes scan the cost of the item. The register sums it up. You enter into it what the customer has given you, and it tells you what the change is. And I have known many cashiers these days who don't even think about calculating the change, but just look at the register and see what it says, and then give you that change. So the 3 R's, in a functional sense, are not, strictly speaking, necessary anymore. But why should we teach them? The question I'm ultimately getting at, the deep question, is what is education, public education in particular, what is it for? Are we training people for the workplace? Are we training people for life? Are we keeping them out of the workplace during their tender years? What are we doing? Most people, I believe, don't have any hard evidence, but most people, I believe, don't like school. They don't like formal education. They don't like being made to sit down, be quiet, do their work, do their writing or sums or whatever. They can't wait to leave. And unfortunately, a great number of them become politicians, and in fact, a few of them become teachers. And they teach in the way that they were taught. They don't think about the philosophy behind teaching. Why do we teach people how to read and write? Why do we teach people how to do advanced arithmetic? What is it all for? I would guess that when you ask most teachers that question, they don't have a good answer. And my answer is that a lot of the way that we consider education and what we consider to be basic education is misguided. I believe that the best education is one in which students are taught from the earliest ages how to think critically. Now, the educational theorist Piaget had an idea that different ages were good at doing different things, like memorizing was one of the things that people were very good at very early, and then critical thinking comes later. But Maria Montessori had a very different point of view. She argued for a whole different kind of education. So now I've mentioned some of the big guns: Montessori, Steiner, Piaget. They all had their own ideas as to what was important. But my educational philosophy, and I homeschooled my son, my philosophy was to go where he wanted to go, which is the Montessori method, and to help him develop in those areas. But as he developed, I wanted to make sure he was thinking critically. I consider that to be the most basic. That, for me, is primary education. Okay, I'm going to continue on next Friday, cooking on Tuesday, and more about education on Friday, and particularly about the move from primary education to secondary education. And meanwhile, tell your friends, like and subscribe, and I'll bring you my Chinese chicken recipes on Tuesday.